The rescue of civilians during the Korean War climaxes with the Christmas Day miracle of the greatest rescue operation by a single ship in the history of mankind. Now that should be a movie. Hello, and thank you for watching today's episode of That Should Be a Movie. I'm C.W. Johnson Jr. Today's book I like to pitch as a movie is Ship of Miracles, 14,000 Lives in One Miraculous Voyage by Bill Gilbert from Triumph Books. The SS Meredith Victory was a United States Merchant Marine Liberty ship built to transport supplies during World War II. She was taken out to the reserve fleet during the Korean War and captained by Leonard LaRue, also a seafaring veteran of World War II. Her first assignment during the Korean War was supplying the landing at Incheon. On her return from Incheon, an incident occurred that would have a profound impact on Captain LaRue. They were approached by a boat containing North Korean soldiers who were waving a white flag. Besides from LaRue's .38 revolver, the ship was unarmed, and the NKPA soldiers could have easily overtaken it. Nevertheless, LaRue took them aboard. After the ship's doctor, Robert J. Lonnie, doctored the wounds of one of the soldiers. The crew was surprised to learn that the North Korean soldiers wanted out of the army and were more than willing to give up information. From this, LaRue deduced that most of the North Korean soldiers were conscripts and were being forced to fight for a cause they did not believe. This would influence his decision a few months later at Hungnam. The scene at Hungnam, North Korea, December 1950, was one of biblical proportions. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children had ridden and walked hundreds of miles to the port in order to escape with the United States forces, which were withdrawing in the face of the invading Chinese communists. They were anti-communist activists, landowners, businessmen, educators, escaped political prisoners, Christians, schoolgirls, and common citizens who had served as public officials under the UN's occupation. They had been under communist rule for 5 years and were voting with their feet for freedom. The last train from the city of Hamhung had 50,000 people clamoring to climb aboard. These refugees had faced many dangers coming to the port. They had seen friends and family killed by landmines, airplanes, or by stray bullets when they were caught in the crossfire of the opposing forces. Many froze to death in the sub-zero temperatures. Others were turned back by military police who feared there might be infiltrators or spies among them. Still, the majority made it to Hungnam, where they huddled in whatever shelter they could find in the freezing winds. At the port were 193 ships of all types, including LSTs, waiting to participate in one of the greatest military evacuations of all time. General Ned Almond was flying with Lieutenant Alexander M. Haig Jr. over the evacuation when he looked down and saw thousands of refugees wading through the icy surf to get to the ships. He turned to Haig and said, "We can't leave those people. Take care of that, Haig." On the beach, Marine Colonel Edward Forney was overseeing the evacuation. When he received the order that the refugees needed to be evacuated too, he somehow found the ships necessary to transport 100,000 civilians. As the refugees waited, they watched the fire from the naval guns, like stars falling on the horizon. At first, there was resentment towards helping a mass of refugees who might be concealing enemy soldiers. However, public pressure at home was upon the military command to do the merciful thing. According to Stanley Weintraub, author of A Christmas Far From Home, the American-led command could not be perceived in the States, especially as Christmas approached, as abandoning Christians to the less than tender mercies of non-believing colonists. The most vocal proponents of helping the refugees were powerful American conservatives who were the children of Christian ministers and missionaries to Asia. Henry Luce, publisher of Life and Time magazines, DeWitt Wallace, publisher of Reader's Digest, and foreign policy advisor John Foster Dulles were among them. All on the ground, Dr. Bong Hok Hyun, a Korean civil affairs officer, and Father Patrick Clearly, a chaplain with the 10th Corps and former missionary, pleaded daily with the military to do more to help the refugees. Colonel Florney reminded Allman that the refugees had fought the communists for 5 years and had risked their lives by cooperating with the Americans. On December 16th, President Truman declared the evacuation from North Korea a national emergency, issuing Presidential Proclamation number 2914, which included aiding the refugees. Allman sent a train to bring more refugees to the docks. When Dr. Hyun informed a group of elderly Christians praying in the basement of a church about the train, one of them exclaimed, "Moses has come to evacuate us." The Meredith Victory was offloading jet fuel at Busan, South Korea, when it received orders to sail for Hungnam. Captain LaRue immediately obeyed, and the ship left Busan before all the jet fuel could be offloaded. When the ship arrived at the port, LaRue signaled to the minesweeper, which was to guide him through the heavily mined harbor, that jet fuel was on board. The minesweeper's crew was shocked because Russian submarines were rumored to be lurking beneath the water. If a torpedo or mine hit the Meredith Victory, the explosion would take down any ships nearby. As the minesweeper guided the ship through the harbor, LaRue noticed that the distance between them was getting wider. Once in the harbor, the Meredith Victory was boarded by several Army colonels. They met LaRue and some of his staff and informed him of the situation. They said they could not order him to take refugees on board, since the ship was designed to hold only a 47-man crew and 12 passengers. Instead, they asked him to concur with his crew about taking some aboard. Dr. Lonnie remembers that LaRue did not hesitate. He said he would take as many as possible. The crew was with him. LaRue ordered the ship turned around to face the sea, enabling a quick getaway. They were not going to give up the Meredith Victory if the Chinese suddenly attacked. Then they began taking on refugees, lowering them down into the fifth hold, 5 levels below the deck, with pallets usually used to lower cargo. Floodlights were turned on, making the ship an easy target for the Chinese, who had already been spotted on the ridges surrounding Hungnam. But no enemy shell ever hit the ship that was loaded down with fuel and people. The mass of people could have easily been hit mistakenly by American shells too, but mercifully that never happened. At first, the crew separated the refugees by gender, but when they realized they were separating families, they stopped. Sadly, One small girl was crushed to death in the rush to get on the ship and was buried on the beach. When the refugees noticed that more room was needed on the ship, they began to throw their only remaining earthly belongings overboard so others could join them. The crew loaded the refugees onto the ship all through the night of December 22nd and into the morning of the 23rd. Somehow, by some miracle, 18,000 tons of steel stretched until 14,000 men, women, and children were aboard. The holes were filled up and the deck was covered with people. Right before the Meredith Victory departed, a jeep drove up and an army lieutenant jumped out. He, along with 17 South Korean MPs, came aboard to guard against any possible communist infiltrators who were rumored to be among the refugees. The Meredith Victory was one of the last ships to leave the harbor of Hungnam. On board were the last of 100,000 refugees. Beyond Hungnam, the communists were pinned down by a ring of Navy fire and the freshly arrived 3rd Infantry Division of the United States Army. They covered the withdrawal of the other Army and Marine units, then created Line Charlie to cover the rescue of the North Korean civilians. A veteran of the 3rd Infantry, Leo Meyer, remembers that the beach was completely clear of refugees as they withdrew. They were all survivors. The Meredith Victory continued south. The civilians were starving and thirsty. One man found a boiled egg and swallowed it whole before anyone could stop him. Some of the crew members heard banging on the porthole to their cabin. When they opened it, they were assailed by the arms of dozens of refugees begging for water. They gave them what little water they could and then closed the porthole. The decks were swept by bitterly cold winds. Dr. Lonnie was walking among the refugees when he saw some of them building cooking fires on the drums of jet fuel. Yelling no and waving his hands, he and his officers put the fires out. The Koreans understood and built no more fires. What could have been the greatest sea disaster in history became the greatest rescue by sea in history. Tension hung in the air as rumors circulated that the ship was going further out to sea to dump the refugees overboard. A riot could have started, and the young men could have easily taken the control room. Somehow, the Korean MPs and the crew were able to convince them all that safety was only a few hours away. At one point, it was discovered that a North Korean communist spy was on board, dressed as an MP. He was quickly captured and shackled to a post until the end of the voyage. Despite the horrendous conditions, no lives were lost on the 450-mile voyage. Instead, the ship docked with 5 more souls than it had when it departed from Hungnam. Babies had been born. The Korean women, used to giving birth in the fields, helped the mothers deliver as though it was no big deal. The American doctors weren't needed. The appearance of new life brought smiles of joy among the rugged conditions. The Meredith Victory first went to Busan, but the city was already overcrowded with refugees, so it continued on to an island 50 miles away called Koju. But not before LaRue sliced through red tape to get blankets, food, clothing, and water from the military supplies for the people on board. The ship arrived at the island on Christmas Eve and began unloading the next day. There are no docks, so LSTs had to transport the refugees to the beach. The people were placed on platforms used for transporting supplies and machinery on board. Each platform could hold 16 people. The platforms were then lowered down to the LSTs. The swelling sea heaved up and down, causing the ship to pitch. The refugees could have fallen from the platforms and been swallowed by the waves, but all made it to safety. Throughout the evacuation and voyage, the crew had been astonished at the Koreans' stoic lack of expression. But the closer the refugees came to safety, the more the crew saw heartwarming expressions of joy on their faces. The crew began sharing their clothing with the refugees. Fathers took their sashes from around their waist and tied them around their children to lower them to the LSTs. One sailor saw a 7-year-old girl wearing light clothing standing in the bone-chilling air. Yet she was smiling the smile of a happy little girl because she knew she was almost safe, almost free. I believe the story of the Meredith victory is the perfect candidate for a holiday season movie release because it conveys the true meaning of Christmas. The sailors wrote letters home that the Koreans were still preparing to celebrate Christmas despite the approaching war. Hanging streamers across their doorways were the words, "Celebrating the birth of Christ." It is an epic story of American bravery and one of the greatest examples of American compassion in history. President Eisenhower bestowed the title of Gallant Little Ship on the Meredith victory. The crew has been honored with the Korean Presidential Unit Citation and the United States Merchant Marine's highest award, the Meritorious Service Medal. Gilbert's book is one of the few books about the rescue, and sadly suffers from disjointed narration that relies too much on direct quotations. A movie could cause more books to be published. A South Korean filmmaker has tried to make a movie called Christmas Cargo, but it was never picked up for production. It is said that 1 in 4 South Koreans is a descendant of the 100,000 refugees rescued at Hungnam. Their parents and grandparents, most of all, should be honored. Captain LaRue, who retired to become a monk, sums the story of the Meredith victory up best. The message of Christmas, the message of kindness and goodwill, had come to the slowly laden ship, to these people aboard who, like the Holy Family many centuries before, were themselves refugees from a tyrannical force. I thought as I watched, there was no room for them, no room in their native land. Because the inspiring true story of 100,000 people rescued from tyranny sums up the Christmas spirit, I believe that Ship of Miracles by Bill Gilbert should be a holiday season movie release. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and share with all your friends. And let me know in the comment section below what inspirational story from American history you think should be a holiday season movie release. Merry Christmas, America!